Hello, I'm Mike James. Today we're at the Experience Music Project to meet a Northwest legend.
Patrick O'Day!
In the 1960s, Pat O'Day ruled rock radio in Seattle as disc jockey and program director for Powerhouse Top 40 AM station
KJR, Seattle, Channel 95.
A teen dance circuit he started at a local club called the Spanish Castle grew to become the largest concert promotion company in the world, Concerts West. O'Day influenced the tastes of a whole generation of teenage listeners, and today is considered a key figure in the development of rock and roll and top 40 radio in the Northwest. Throughout the years, O'Day rubbed shoulders with the biggest names in the business, including the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley, and Jimi Hendrix. He tells all in his book, It Was All Just Rock and Roll. You say something on page 164 of the book. You say that KJR was more than just another radio station. I love the phrase here. It was a living, breathing, informative, enormously funny member of hundreds of thousands of Seattle area families. It's hard to conceive of radio being that now. But could you recreate that time for me, that you were this thing to so many people?
You see, we didn't know there were any limitations to how big our listening audience could be. We didn't know there were any limitations to what a radio station could be. Now we know there are no limitations except those you put on yourself, because the radio station KJR went to over a 30 share in the Puget Sound area in the mid-60s. Over 30% of all radios were listening to that station because the station was an important part of the family. It gave you great news, in-depth news, with great tempo and, of course, abbreviated newscasts. It gave you a broad selection of music to listen to. We didn't just take one corner of rock and roll. We played everything from a Patsy Cline, the country type hits, to Don Gibson, to Roy Clark, to Willie Nelson, to the Motown sound, to Perry Como, we played a broad array of music. And we tied it all together with very personable and very funny and very emotional entertainers called our disc jockeys. And those disc jockeys, you can't fool the public. They either like someone, and someone's either providing something special for their life or they aren't. So when people like Lan Roberts and Larry Lujack and Dick Curtis and Jerry Kay and all those great names out of those years, they became real institutions in the town and enjoyed and treasured members of all those families.
What did you look for in those guys?
Make me laugh. Make me laugh. Make me cry. Make me do something, but above all, make me laugh. And I wanted a good disc jockey to make me laugh, make me emotionally respond at least every half an hour.
Well, tell me about the evolution of the dances that you were doing. Because you were bringing in bands, you bring in the Kingsmen or the Wailers, and playing at dances beyond what was going on the radio station. What was the evolution of that? Well, how did that get started?
We had a new kind of dancing taking place to rock and roll. It seemed like this is even just as American Bandstand is beginning in '57, but it seemed like this new music was bringing about a new kind of energy and a new kind of innovative dancing was taking place. We're talking in 1956 when we're really talking about rock and roll in its embryonic stage. So first in Astoria, Oregon, my first full-time radio job after I got out of school, I staged a rock and roll dance at the National Guard Armory with a rather rudimentary rock and roll band that had grown up in the area, and then I would play records and combination record hop, live music, dance. It was successful. I moved then to Longview, Kelso, rented the National Guard Armory. We put together a rock band from down by Portland, and I did the same thing when I got to Yakima. So when I arrived in Seattle, it was only natural that I would try and put together a rock and roll dance. And I, with the Wailers, discovered that this place out on the south end on Highway 99 called the Spanish Castle was failing in business because they ran the standard old orchestra, the Gordon Green Orchestra, on Saturday night. and enjoyed what was left of a vanishing era, but the Spanish Castle was losing money. I went in with the Wailers, and we ran the first rock and roll dance at the Spanish Castle in October of 1959. It was immediately a hit. Followed that a month later on the night before Thanksgiving with Conway Twitty, and we sold out and turned 1,000 people away, and rock and roll dances in the Pacific Northwest were off and running. But now, so I immediately opened up Sheridan Park Hall in Bremerton, the Crescent Ballroom in Tacoma. Soon Lake Hills Roller Rink in Bellevue was added to the equation, Parker's on Aurora, Linwood Rollaway Skating Rink, and now I need an enormous amount of talent to fill the stages of these dances. And there were a lot of what we called then garage bands. These were young, aspiring rock and roll musicians that all they needed was the opportunity, and we knew they could blossom. And soon out of the Seattle area come, groups like the Frantics, the Checkers, Little Bill and the Blue Notes, eventually the Sonics, and the Kingsmen, and Don and the Good Times, and the Viceroys, and there was people, Merrily Rush and the Turnabouts. An amazing amount of talent blossomed from our area, gave great encouragement to young people like Jimi Hendrix. So a young man approached me at the Spanish Castle. I think it was late 1960, early 61. Came up to me. I could tell he was of unusual lineage, and very, very polite, very shy. And he said, "Mr. O'Day," he said, "could I talk to you a moment?" And we went backstage, and he said, "I have an amplifier in my car," and he described the amplifier, and it was the biggest, beefiest one made at the time. And he said, if a band blows its amp, I'm here every Friday night. He said, "I will loan you my amp if you will let me get up behind on the stage and play the guitar with him." He said, "I won't get in the way, and don't worry, I know all their licks. I know and I said, "Fine, And it was about a month later that Tiny Tony and the Statics were playing. They blew the amps. The kid, I didn't even have to, he was on his way to the car. And now I forget all this, okay? And I'm sitting in the dressing room in Dallas in 1967, late 67. And the guy who now my national concert company is so proud to handle exclusively for the whole world is a guy named Jimi Hendrix, in a deal that I'd known he was from Seattle, but a deal that had been put together in New York. And so Jimmy and I were sitting and talking as we would on these occasions. Jimmy said, "Do you remember where we first met?" And I said, "You mean in New York?" He says, "Nope, before then." He said, and lo and behold, he started into the story. That was the young man.
He was the kid.
He was the kid with the amplifier. And whether that was what caused him to decide to throw all of his chips with my company or not, I don't know. But I think it was part of it, because he said, in effect, when they gave me the option of going with you, I figured, how can we go wrong? And he said, "And you were the one that gave me my first shot," which he said kind of facetiously, because it wasn't a shot, but it was interesting.
Yeah. This is a good time to talk about what was the evolution from, you were doing these teen dances where there would be live music for dancing,
right.
and all these wonderful bands that you talked about. What was the evolution then that went from the teen dances to much larger performances and presentations in bigger arenas? Is that something that you saw coming, or was it a natural evolution? What was going on here?
It was something that I thought had to happen. You see, performers that we're working with at the dances, like Roy Orbison and the Beach Boys, and so many acts are musically so superb, and it was my dream that we be able to present them in the ideal music venue, in the ideal music circumstances. And so we opened the World's Fair. Zolly Volchok and I did a thing called the World's Fair opening twist party at the old Orpheum Theater where the Westin Hotel now stands, with Joey D and the Starlighters, Dee Dee Sharp, the Dovells, and headlining Chubby Checker. And we did 2 days of shows to open the World's Fair, and they all sold out. Yeah. So immediately after the World's Fair was over, I reserved some dates at the Opera House, because I thought that maybe it was time that rock and roll be presented with a massa class. And so with the ushers in tuxedos, and we indicated in the commercials, dress nice. I mean, this is going to be a great event, and everyone did.
There's another issue with concerts beginning to emerge, the emergence of the rock and roll concert. That had to do with the speakers. They just couldn't handle the sound.
We moved from the Opera House to the Coliseum, which had been the Washington State Pavilion during the World's Fair. We moved there with the arrival of the completion of the Coliseum as a venue for the Supersonics and so on. Eventually the Supersonics. We moved there because the Beatles came to town, and that was the first show in the Coliseum.
This is an old Little Richard song, and it's called Long Tall Sally. I'm gonna tell Mary, Uncle Tom, had the magic baby, got a lot of fun, oh baby. Yeah, my baby. Ooh, baby.
Yes, they came to see the Beatles. The show sold out, but they did not come to hear the Beatles, or they may have thought they were going to hear the Beatles, but you could hear nothing but the screams. And even if the screams had not been present, it was still not going to be a valid musical experience because the sound systems were so inadequate. There were no sound systems that would fill a building of that size, especially when you take into consideration the fact you're playing with loud electrical amps now that no one had experienced before. And so as a result, the concerts were an experience where you went and you saw the act and you were a part of the screaming and the yelling and so on, but a musical experience it was not. And in the end, the solution was not as the electrical engineers had tried to design, with all kinds of little speakers pointing all different sorts of angles and hanging them throughout the auditorium. No, the solution was, as we see it today, brute force. Stacks of Macintosh amplifiers and batteries of great big speakers hanging over the stage, and that was the solution. But it took years for that to... the first really great system was done for Led Zeppelin.
One of the artists that you handled for a while through Concerts West was Elvis Presley. You have a wonderful story about his manager, Colonel Parker, and how Colonel Parker said he was going to get you in a picture with Elvis. Wasn't quite what you expected.
Beneath the Space Needle. The Colonel, I was the music director and the program director of KJR and the disc jockey, but we had already established a reputation as being one of the stations in the nation that will play new songs and will take a chance on new songs. And so as a result, people like Colonel Parker, had a high level of familiarity with KJR and with me. And so now Elvis is in town shooting his motion picture during the World's Fair. I get a call from Colonel Parker, and he said, "Pat, would you like to be in the picture with Elvis?" Well, can you imagine? Here I am, a disc jockey, and he is giving me the opportunity to be in a motion picture with Elvis. A dream come true. Yeah. And he said, are there any other guys on your staff that you'd like to include? And I said, well, yeah. He said, just be wearing coats and ties, white shirts, which, by the way, Elvis was wearing throughout that motion picture. Dress norms were so different then. And he said, be there Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, and we'll meet you there at the equipment tent right there by the Needle and so on. So we're there, and pretty soon Elvis had been doing some shooting up by the Needle with a young girl, and Elvis came down. The Colonel says, now stay here and be ready. And we don't know what role we're going to play, but we're going to... Well, Elvis walks up. the colonel gets us, says, come on over here, you know, and said, now you guys all met Elvis. I had met Elvis, but said hi to him again, and so on. And the colonel says, now line up. And we got in a line, and he signaled, and a photographer came over and brought his camera up and shot the picture. And the colonel walks up to me, he said, Pat, congratulations, you've just been in a picture with Elvis.
Not what you expected.
Is that funny?
You write in your book near the end, the kind of radio I miss no longer exists, which is, you know, the KJR that you had no longer exists.
Right.
Could something like that be created again, that kind of dominance?
Could it happen? Of course it could. Nothing is, people haven't changed. So exciting, fun, enjoyable, funny, entertaining radio could be even more effective today. But will it happen in the present radio ownership environment? It's very, very doubtful. I don't blame Infinity or Clear Channel or these massive new chains that have accumulated thousands of stations. It's not their fault. It's Congress that let it happen. But what Congress did was they destroyed one of the greatest natural resources we had, and that was local radio. But they destroyed something else, because so essential to our way of government, so essential to democracy, is an informed electorate, not just at the national level, but at the local level, because we elect our local leaders as well. Yet, by eliminating local radio, by eliminating the requirement that all stations carry X amount of news every hour, those things were essential to informing not just the public, but informing young people. And I think that the deregulation of radio is one of the biggest single causes of the dumbing down of America, where you can go out on the street and ask them who our Secretary of State is, or ask them who the Vice President of the United States is, and 30% will tell you they don't know. America is being dumbed down, and that problem started when the FCC and Congress foolishly deregulated radio. Radio, as I called it, a great natural resource because it informed the people, it informed the electorate, and it entertained, but also it did something else. It gave great service to the local community because it was local. The radio people were local. They lived in the town. They helped the town with community service, with involvement. It was such a vibrant addition, such a vibrant source of energy, information, and assistance in every city that radio performed. And now, by turning it over to the big conglomerates and so much of the programming coming from New York or Chicago or who knows where, radio has not made a step in the right direction. It's made a step in the wrong direction. And now they're talking about further deregulation, where newspapers can own the television stations in the town, which does nothing but creates the obvious conflict of interest.
How do you cast yourself in this history? Because, you know, someone reading the book, as I did, you embody an extraordinary history, from the beginnings of rock and roll radio to the real beginnings of big rock and roll concerts.
I guess I've always thought of myself as someone that got up every day and tried to do whatever it was I was doing a little bit better, so it would be a little more successful. And I was never afraid to innovate. I've taken big gambles. I've lost sometimes, but sometimes I win. But growth only occurs through gambling, through taking a chance. And I loved this thing called radio, and I loved this thing called our rock and roll music, and it was on those things that I was at any time willing to take a chance on a good new idea. And it came about at a time when I don't know we will ever see so great a change take place as we saw from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s. During that 20-year span, when I was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, I made a little speech. And my comment was how thrilling it is to see that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland and the EMP in Seattle, because for us that were there, we remember when there was such a stigma attached to what we were doing. People thought of disc jockeys and this rock and roll as kind of a compaction in the colon of society, and they wished it would go away. Yeah. And that thing that people were so leery of and in many cases despised, now look, we have these giant tributes to that era, and it has become the music of the world. It's probably become the most unifying thing on the planet. That thing that we struggled to present just a few years back.
These days, Pat O'Day is a top real estate agent in the San Juan Islands. Of course, there are many more Pat O'Day stories that we had time to talk about, but they're all in Pat's book. It was all just rock and roll.
You're watching the Pat O'Day program in the afternoon.
You're on your mark.